Hi everybody and welcome to today's MediaWorks Masterclass. Today we're going to be covering websites that perform in the age of AI. I say it all the time in each of these masterclasses, AI is definitely the buzzword of 2026. We were already talking about it in 2025, so I think we're probably a bit further on in terms of refinement, knowledge, understanding, etc. But I think today we're really going to focus on designing experiences for users, teams and LLMs, which is something that we've been talking a lot about across MediaWorks. Yeah. So as a way of introducing myself, for those that don't know, my name's David Norris. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at MediaWorks. Today I've got Johnny with me.
I'm Johnny. I'm a UX Director at MediaWorks. My focus sits between our data and insights teams, our dev teams, and sitting across our design team to make sure we get the most out of our digital experiences.
Fantastic. And we've also got Paul.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Paul Davidson. I'm the Technology and Experience Director at MediaWorks. Basically, I manage the kind of web development function in the business.
Fantastic. So, as I say, we've got a breadth of experience here that we're going to be sort of challenging general conceptions or misconceptions around websites and the role that they play and how they engage in this new world that we're living in with all the LLMs that we keep talking about regularly. So today there's going to be really three key focuses, and it's going to be one, the big shift. So websites that now ultimately have three audiences, so users, content managers and LLMs. We're then going to move on to why this matters now. So again, thinking about why your website might not be the destination anymore, it's the source, and thinking of it like that is quite different. I know it's something we've been working with a lot of clients on recently. And then ultimately, what performance means today. You know, we are performance at our core, I think, in terms of an agency at MediaWorks. So really, we want to think about what does that ultimately mean from a performance perspective and whether the content can be understood and used by both humans and machines. So, Johnny, I guess we talked about it there, we touched on it. So designing for three audiences now is slightly different to where we used to be. Like, we used to be so user-centric, didn't we? And now we've ultimately got this world where we're now focusing on how do we make it really usable for content managers, so people actually managing the content within a website, but also how do LLMs actually engage with the content that we're placing on website?
Yeah, exactly that. I think there's a new player in the game, and it's almost the conversation and the way we would always work was very much understanding who the user was, the reason they would come to the site, how we can help them and support them move through. We would also work very closely with clients or partners to understand how we build an experience that supports internal efficiencies and autonomy to help content managers develop the site, keep it maintained, and make sure they're in a place where they have a platform that they can succeed with. We now have this view of LLMs where effectively we need to make sure that we have structured content and we give context to the meaning of the content that we have on site to support that website or that LLM finding the content that it needs from that site, from that experience, which then becomes a little bit different to the users that we'd normally engage with, whereby we might be having conversations with those users on how do we drive engagement, how do we drive conversion, whereas actually this is very much making sure we have the right content, the context wrapped around it, and we're displaying that content in multiple ways or facets to try and elevate that content for effectively what can become a zero-click search or somebody who is very much at the start of that informational journey.
Yeah, and I think that's becoming like definitely been the conversation that we've been having with a lot of clients, a lot of partners, a lot of prospects around what does that all actually mean. And I think like on this slide, sort of, we often see like websites that fail for a number of reasons, and I think it's fair to say sort of we've got a few examples here.
Yeah, I think content written for campaigns, not intent, and it's effectively understanding how an LLM might, or sort of large language model, and by that, obviously, just to give context, we're talking about your ChatGPTs, your AI overviews, your Geminis, your Perplexities, and all of those, just understanding where they're pulling that content from. And I think it's if we are setting up a website that is campaign driven, specifically around whether that's seasonality campaigns, whether it's product campaigns, whether it's launches in that space, what we're not doing is necessarily giving wide context of a product, a source, and the truthful information that your LLM will see as trustworthy content that it can surface within that, because you're driving for for so much of that transactional piece at the end of the funnel, you're missing the informational piece up front.
Yeah, and then like the next point around like pages that are built around sort of navigation, not questions. Again, it was really interesting as a client that we've only just started working with. Like I was thinking about them the other day, used to have like specific URLs for every FAQ. Do you know what I mean? And it was really an interesting model because that in lots of ways made sense in a previous world, but now it just doesn't work.
Yeah, and back then it was very much looking at SEO and how do you answer every single question to make sure that you have some ranking visibility for each of those individual pieces. But now with LLMs, it's around the context of a whole situation. And effectively, if you think about it going into your website as being the library, what an LLM doesn't want to do is try to find 100 FAQs. You've answered 100 books effectively in that library at once, an encyclopedia. So it's making sure that we have the content in one structured format where we're answering multiple questions in various different ways and giving different perspectives of it or different aspects of those questions, so it can ultimately pull out the context it needs to give and source that information.
And I guess the final point is sort of poor structure and inconsistent semantics is obviously a massive challenge.
Yeah, and for me, it's very much making sure that if we're utilizing core data, if we're utilizing the right structure, and I do have an example in here as we kind of go through, it's making sure we have it structured correctly and breaking it down in the right format that we can then extract that information at the right level to get the right answers.
Yeah, and that teases up nicely, I think, Johnny, for sort of the next section that we're going into, where we're talking about, like, how do you develop a structure that performs? Because I think it's fair to say, like, again, we used to think of it being very much user first, and there is an element of that still, 100%. Like, we're still building websites that need to speak to humans when humans engage with them. It's just, as you say, we've got this now other element that we've got to consider, this other player in the party, if you like.
Yeah, definitely. And as we kind of talked about there, shifting from pages to topics, and that does touch on the piece that you mentioned before around the FAQs, where you would build out multiple pages for different FAQs or different things, but actually what you want to do is condense that down into overarching topics and make sure that we're holding all of the content in one place to give a much closer end-to-end view of a subject. And I think that for me is how we're reshaping some of the content and some of the journeys that we're building on site. Don't get me wrong, we would never shift away from designing for the end user.
Yeah.
Like, absolutely, we want our website to focus on that. But you are in this emerging world of the content being surfaced a lot earlier. So you need to understand that the context needs to be given as almost the narrative of that topic, not just splitting that out as separates.
And I think that is the point, though, isn't it? Is like the content has to still be written for the end user, but ultimately
absolutely.
we have to think about how we are structuring that content now in a slightly different way. You know, like pages have got a lot deeper. Like that's been one of the things that I've really noticed, and I know we talk to clients about that, and it obviously links into that concept around like topics, not just pages anymore. And I think again that's a really interesting approach, isn't it? Because we used to want a direct here, and then you click through to another section and all the rest of it. Well, the reality is that for argument's sake, a Google perspective or any LLM, it's like that's taking up the crawl budget. That's costing them a lot of energy to go through another link to go to another place. So again, it's really interesting, isn't it, to consider that. So I guess then that leads us on to then what does a good structure look like?
Yeah, for me, I think it's that hierarchy of content. It's very clear in the structure. We're starting, and I'll go through a deeper example, but we're starting with an overview, giving key takeaways. We're breaking down content, making sure it's easy to follow the structure of that. I think within that structure, we need to make sure that we have original data. There needs to be something that LLM, in the same way that a human user does, as they want to go through, they want to see it backed up by data. They want to see something that it can follow and say, this is the truth, and this is what we need to understand. Semantic HTML, we want to make sure that the page structure is built in the correct way that it can surface all of that content. We don't want content hidden in certain areas. We want to make sure everything can be surfaced, everything can be found when it is doing a crawl of that page. And then the internal linking, I think, it's really important to make sure that we have have that in place. I think, as you kind of touched on there, like we do have these longer pages, but we still also don't want to then just go, actually just put all of your content in one place. We want to make sure that we're linking off to relevant pieces, because for both LLMs and users, they do follow that path through to make sure that we can ultimately see how it's linking off, and it will look at what's the knowledge of this brand or this company's website, because actually we're linking off to all these separate questions, and therefore it becomes that encyclopedia versus many books sort of situation of we can see that there's a lot on this subject, so it will direct the information from that space.
And I guess just on this then, I think we've highlighted here sort of some best practice guidelines for writing content on a website.
Yeah, and this is almost, this is a backwards manufactured page that we had been working on with a client of ours, and effectively understanding what we're pulling in here, we're being very clear in terms of pulling through key experts, pulling in authors, making sure from both an SEO standpoint and LLM standpoint that we're putting some validity around this.
Yeah, I was going to say on that one, it's like it goes back to all the EEAT principles from Google around sort of that sort of expertise, and having named people sometimes massively makes a big difference, because the search engines and the LLMs love it to see this unique content.
Yeah, exactly. And then we've got that updated timestamp. We want to make sure that you're not always creating articles for every new thought. We're actually updating this and making sure that we're keeping up with the latest bit of information, which back in the day might have been a case of, you just create new blog posts for everything that comes up. But actually, we want to create informational hubs that are constantly updated, and obviously give it a view of when it was last updated. Are we maintaining that content? Are we keeping it up to date and being at the forefront of this? We're answering common questions. We're making sure that actually the page structure is broken down by the types of content that people are looking for.
Yeah.
And it's almost restructuring and reshaping some of that content as the page breaks down, and making sure we're utilizing it in different ways. It might still be the same data set, but we're looking at it from different angles, because people will ask questions in different ways. People will want to feed into this and understand different specifics around some of that data set that we have. Being clear right from the start, I think for me, there's always an opportunity here to go key takeaways from this article, because we're allowing it to summarize some content up front, and we know LLMs like that, but also human users will like that as well, because I like to see that breakdown before I begin a long read of content. I do want to know what this content's about to tell us and how useful it's going to be to me. And then it's effectively just making sure that we have that structure in place around the breakdown of that data. We're utilizing, comparisons of products. We're utilizing answering FAQs. We're utilizing some instances of maybe some video content that it can reference you to. We're utilizing different breakdowns of information structure, and we're not just going, here's 10 paragraphs of content. We're allowing it to have some context of the different ways that we can slice some of that, and then I've just added to the end there, like, ensuring that the article is scannable from both an LLM standpoint. It wants to read that article as quickly as possible. It doesn't want to use it as crawl budgets to try and get through everything, but also from a human standpoint, you want that article because you may want to click into that source of where that information's come from as an LLM. You don't want to then go, oh wait, hang on, there's 100 paragraphs of content on here I have to try and understand. You want to be able to move through that in a natural way. So that's where it comes into designing for multiple audiences.
Yeah, and I think on this, I think it's such an interesting topic that when we were putting the sessions together, like, this is one of the future masterclasses that we're going to look at, is around like what the role of content is in the age of AI, because I think it's so important. There's so much in this space that you could actually look at and go, how are prompts changing this versus keywords versus like where's the role of creative and imagery, etc. So not just even written content, like different types of content. So we will do a deeper dive into that at a future masterclass, which I'm really looking forward to. But I guess, Paul, then, when it comes to everything that we've just heard there about the challenges and the opportunities that exist in terms of now you've got a number of masters that we're trying to serve, if you like, I guess where you get into is like, how do we go about sort of, and what is the role, I guess, of developing web experiences for LLMs? Like, what has changed?
Yeah, I think from a technology perspective, the biggest shift that we've seen is that like websites are no longer just kind of front end experiences. They're content systems that need to serve multiple audiences, as we've touched on. So, the end user most importantly, but, we're also having to do a lot of work to help content and editorial teams. And then obviously increasingly AI platforms, they're consuming and servicing the content in different ways from websites. So the role of development's kind of shifted from kind of building pages to designing systems, really. So we're making sure that content is kind of structured in the right way, and that it's reusable across the site, and that it's also discoverable.
Yeah, I think like it'd be really interesting because I know we've met with some of our website partners, the likes of WordPress and Bracco, etc. recently, and it's really interesting, isn't it? Because I know you and I were at a session where it's like they're all talking about this in all of their conferences as well. They're talking about, well, we're now designing and we're having to think about different users and different, not just users, but obviously LLMs, and how does it all integrate? And what does that actually mean for the future of website development? So I think it is really, really fascinating. And I think we talk about then, like, and they'll always talk, won't they, about, and there's a link to AI. They're talking about AI to us. But I guess for me, it's like, what does actually being AI ready mean in this space?
Yeah, I think basically it means that your content is structured in a way that, machines or LLMs can interpret it or pick it up as easily as humans can. So, yeah, it's things like having that clear hierarchy of content and consistent formatting and well-defined components, everything kind of linked together well. So like if your content's a bit ambiguous, or if it's kind of overly designed, you've got too much video or animation or stuff going on, it can become harder for AI to kind of read it, and it could effectively become invisible to AI.
Yeah, and I think that's, look, I'm not going to go about the how the discovery journey's changed, but we all know about all the stats. We've been in multiple SEO sessions recently where we've been talking about where SEO, like, or where organic search traffic's headed, the fact that multiple people are now seeing, I think where we're at was, I think it was like in January 2025, I think 5% of people in the UK, because again there's a rollout of this, we're seeing AI overviews for specific searches. I think we're now quoting around sort of anywhere between 60 and 75% of people are being served by us. So again, it's like that traffic is still there, and the keyword volume and the volume people are putting in prompts and searches, etc., is still held. It's just the data's being surfaced now in a different forum, because again, us as users, we're getting more and more comfortable with seeing an AI overview or going, oh yeah, I want to find a bit more about that. So I might, for example, search in Google, or I might see something on social, become aware of a brand, and I might go, oh, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it into Gemini. Do you know what I mean? Or I'm going to put it into Perplexity or whichever platform, that ChatGPT. It's like, all right, and then it's like, right, well, where's that data being surfaced from? And obviously, for most organizations, that repository of data is still being answered within a website platform, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
So I guess, like, how does this all change then, sort of, Paul, in terms of how we're actually building websites?
Yeah, so I think the big changes I've said earlier is kind of, we used to kind of focus on pages and, building pages, designing pages, and almost them being fixed in place. But now there's been a massive shift in the last few years to more kind of component-based systems. So, for example, instead of kind of designing or building a home page and then a service page and then a about page, we're defining content types that are, components that can be reused across any page of the site. So we're doing a kitchen sink of, 50 components that, can be used, and our clients can use the CMS system to kind of build really intuitive pages using this suite of components. So that gives like consistency for users. It also kind of creates that predictable structure for search engines and LLMs, so that they can understand the content as well. But there's a lot more emphasis also on things like taxonomy, and things like, tagging and categorization of content, relationships between content, because that's ultimately what helps to kind of power that discoverability.
Yeah, and I guess when we get that right, I think is an important piece. Like, again, we're working with a lot of clients to understand sort of how do you get that right. And again, we've got an example here of a client we work with. And again, you can see the impact that sort of the new website launch did have because we followed those principles. I think it's fair to say, what we saw was massive increase in visibility. And that, again, is, it's an SEO ranking generally, but it was like, yes, but it worked there, but it also then fed the whole LLM piece as well, which is really important.
Yeah, definitely. I think from my perspective, like even thinking about this one, without going into detail of who it is, it's not a product-driven website. It's an informational-based website because the business that they have is more large-scale.
It's more consultative, isn't it?
So it's almost, we know that those searches will be more around the informational side of things and actually building out and making sure that we have content structures and the flexibility that sits around that to offer the different content types is exactly what gives the platform the ability to have an impact like that. We're putting our best foot forward because we have that flexibility, and that again goes back to the three audiences. It hits our internal users because they have a plethora of components that allows them that flexibility. It means that our end user comes to the platform and is served enough informational content that they're able to get a good grip of exactly what they do as a service, but also supports the LLMs because we're surfacing enough informational content that we're answering questions earlier. And I've seen the AI overviews graph of this as well in terms of how we're surfacing that content. And again, we've took up a lot of space and what was opportunity that is allowing us to drive that content forward. And it's just through shaping some of that content. We know that people search now very differently to what they used to, in terms of you used to put in some keywords into Google and hope that it gave you something back. Now it's conversational. You're almost having a back and forth with, whether it's Gemini or ChatGPT, you will have a back and forth conversation. So search terms, the way you look is changing. It just gives us that flexibility to allow us to have content that shapes like that.
I think that's so important, isn't it? And when we do get it right and how that ultimately comes through, because again, this isn't an isolated thing. I think it's and a lot of people are having conversations, and when we're getting approached to compete for tenders, etc., they're posing the same questions, right? They're all going like, how do we design a website that's future proof in essence? Do you know what I mean? And and that now everybody knows doesn't involve just creating a more personalized experience for the user, which was obviously it's still a massive element and 100% needs to be a real focus of ours, but it's also about how are we actually thinking about LLMs and feeding the platforms the information that they require. And again, I get into then the role of the CMS. So the role of content management system, I guess, is really important, isn't it? We have lots of conversations with lots of different providers about this.
100%. So I think the key thing now is that CMS, needs to be treated almost like a hub for content for the long term. So, getting the platform right at the start, it's basically your content operating system for the long term. It's not just something that you use to edit the content of your site anymore. So, and in Umbraco, for example, that we work with quite a lot, we can configure the structure of all the kind of content models, and we can help to enforce some governance around workflows and permissions, and we can kind of guide editors towards more consistent outputs. But we need to make sure that we're also kind of using tools like AI Copilot, which is a new tool that kind of helps you to produce content and does a lot of the mundane tasks, such as populating alt tags and meta tags based on the page content. It really helps with that stuff. But those kind of tools are only useful when we're kind of building them on top of a really well structured system that we put in place in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. And then again, the point that we talked about there is like, I guess the question people will be asking is, how do you future-proof your website? Again, it's coming up in a lot of the proposals we're putting together. It's conversations we're having with clients. I think for me, it's one of the big takeaways of the day.
Yeah, so I guess it's kind of, these are the kind of 4 pillars really that we kind of look to kind of create that future-proof solution. So the first being, that modular content, so breaking content down into like reusable components, as we said, rather than kind of locking them into individual pages. So that gives you that kind of consistency, makes it easier to manage and makes it far easier for AI to kind of extract and use that data and content. Then you've got that kind of API first or kind of headless approach really. So that's about designing your platform so that your content can be like accessed or used anywhere. So it's not just for your website anymore. You can use it within apps or third-party platforms or even other AI tools as well.
Yeah.
The third is having that kind of really structured data layer. So this is where we kind of define what the content actually is and not just how it looks on page. Having clear schemas and the taxonomy we've talked about and tagging and relationships and all that kind of stuff. And then, that's what allows LLMs and search engines to understand the content properly. And without that layer, your content is much harder to interpret and trust. So it's a really important step. And then continuous optimization, which we're really big on at the moment in terms of getting that mindset that the launch of a website isn't the end. It's not just a fixed project anymore. So, search is evolving all the time. AI is evolving, user behavior is evolving. So, we need to be, measuring performance and refining things over time. That can include things like, testing content formats and, looking at data on how we can improve content and user journeys, things like personalization. And, when we bring all these kind of four things together, you end up with that kind of platform that kind of doesn't just help you today. It isn't just going to perform today. It's going to, adapt as new channels and new technology emerges and grow with you as well over time.
Yeah, it's that continuous improvement mindset, I think. You put there continuous optimization, but and that is 100% correct. But I do think it's like setting yourself up to be able to continuously improve without having to scrap the website, build a website, scrap the website, build a website. And that is a cycle that we've seen, like, again, I think of some of the web pitches we've done recently, Paul, where like you can see a client who's invested significant amounts of money into a website, for example, 5 years ago, and then you can literally just see the performance taper off to get you to the point where it's like, well, what we've now got to do is rebuild a website. And you start going like, you've got to think about how do you set yourself up for that continuous improvement. And I know we've done quite a lot of work recently about what does post-launch look like for a client, like what are the next steps, what's the backlog that we're getting through, like what is our roadmap to continuously improve in a world where like search, discovery, like user experience is changing. The way that we're expected to engage with content is changing all of the time now. Our user behaviors are very different to what they were 12 months ago. So I think it's a fascinating space to be in.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, even from an internal point of view, if we think about how our teams work internally, I don't think there's ever been a time where SEO, UX, paid, all of these development, all of these teams have been so close in what they're doing, because it's almost like there used to be, if you go back 5-10 years ago, almost like the pillars of delivering this, but actually because of the way LLMs come into this and we're all obviously aiming for the end user, you have all of this cross network, and I don't think there's been a time where all of these almost services or product are pushing as one.
I think one of the things that we always like to do as part of the masterclass is offer a free audit. And when we were thinking about this, I think we were talking about like what would really add value to those people that have joined or want to know a bit more, and I think where we landed upon was sort of like our experts doing a website review, considering how your website is structured for discoverability, how it's currently performing, and understanding that future readiness for AI piece as well. I mean, we keep saying future AI readiness. The reality is we're in that mode right now. So it's like we're operating in that space. So if anybody's interested and is obviously watching, listening on catch up, wants to know more about how their website is currently performing and what they might need to do and consider as they move forward, then please do click the link in the chat. Please do sign up, and we'll make sure that our experts do sort of use our tools to have a once over, because again, we appreciate, especially in the AI world and discoverability world, there's so many different tools out there, and it's very, very confusing in terms of like the systematization of performance. So I think for me, again, we'll quite happily have a look at that for your organization. So please do drop it into the chat. I guess then where we want to finish, where we always finish, is key takeaways. And I think for me, this is almost a session in itself, as I've said previously. But I think what we wanted to just say is what AI engines look for from your website's content when selecting sources. I think it's fair to say that sort of AI systems, whether it be, as I say, ChatGPT, Gemini, Perplexity, etc. They're not just looking for pages that index well. Do you know what I mean? They are looking for something different now. So what we've got to think about is it's still about having quality content, you know, and I'm not going to go into what quality content is, but it's about having that quality content and a structure that works, you know. So you've got to think about your content structure. I think, Paul, we've also got to think about the technical side of it as well.
Yeah, so it's things like having, you know, the right schema in place. It's, you know, making sure that, you know, the site's indexable and it's crawlable from both search engines and LLMs. So yeah, having the foundations in place, things like LLM TXT file, which is your equivalent to your robots TXT file. So telling AI tools, you know, this is the content that I want you to pick up and this is what I want you to surface to people.
Yeah.
This is the stuff I don't want you to touch, that kind of thing. So just having all the right foundations in place to make sure that, you know, your content's being discovered.
Yeah, and then from a UX perspective, which again we've sort of touched on, but loosely as we've gone through this, but it is a massive element of designing for, as I keep saying, human users and LLMs is a really interesting concept.
Yeah, I think first one is almost that space of trust, and the exact conversation I've had over the last few years is building trust with a human user is now actually building trust with an LLM and making sure that kind of goes back to the book and encyclopedia analogy, but it's that it has one place to gather all of its information, and then it builds trust with you as a trusted source to know coming back to you, it gets fed everything that it wants rather than having to go to 100 different places. Making sure that users can navigate without friction, whether you have a user who is no-click, understanding you within your AI overviews or an LLM, who then does come through to your site, you want to make sure that becomes quite seamless. What they've done is gone from having almost a conversational overview of some information into a space where we can become a little bit conversion ready, but we still want to make sure that that journey is the right cadence, it's the right sentiment, it's the right speed that they move through that. And then into pages that are accessible where we can see the content, the LLMs are understanding the breakdown of that content, but the user also is able to read and understand that content, and then moving them through that conversion ready experience when it's right to do so.
Yeah, I think it's so important. And again, they're just three areas that we will explore in future masterclasses. But I think it's fascinating for people to start to think about how that relates to what they're doing in their own context. I guess finally, sort of the key takeaways, three key takeaways, I guess, is that you're now designed for three audiences. We've talked about that. I feel like we don't need to talk anymore about that. Structure is ultimately as important as design. I think we went very design-led, and I think now we're also having to much more think about the structure because, again, it is about, from a technical perspective, how crawlable is it? How can we actually provide a nice experience for an LLM to engage with our content? And again, what I would finish by saying is AI does reward clarity, not cleverness. I think like there's too many instances, isn't there, where people are trying to be overly engineered. Do you know what I mean? In this space, and actually, the goal isn't to chase algorithms. Like, you know, we can't be trying to game the system all the time. It's to build a system that adapts. Like, because if you're trying to build for an algorithm that exists right now, the reality is it's going to change in 3 months anyway. So you're going to constantly be chasing that. So actually, it is about having that continuous optimization, continuous improvement approach that I think is like so important as we move forward.
Yeah.
I think that brings us to the end of the session, where we've covered obviously websites that perform in the age of AI. I think hopefully it's given everybody a lot of food for thought. And again, if you're interested in the audit, please do sign up. But if not, then thank you very much for joining today's MediaWorks Masterclass. And I look forward to seeing you at a future one. Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks, Johnny.
Cheers.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.